Now remember, the folio is worth 30% of your overall grade, and while I will look through the entire folder, which makes up your folio, only 10 pages of that is actually sent away to the SACE board for moderation. So within your 10 pages, you're expected to show against 6 different performance standards. So the 6 performance standards that are marked against in your folio are Planning 1, which is the consideration and refinement of a question. Planning 2, which is the planning of research processes that are specific to your question. Development 1, which is the development of the research. Development 2, which is analysis of information and exploration of ideas in order to develop the research. Development 3, which is the development of knowledge and skills specific to the question. And Development 4, which is understanding and development of a capability. So within your 10 pages that will be moderated, you have to show against each one of those performance standards, and it is suggested that those performance standards are shown across a range of different pages. Each one of them is as important as the others, so make sure as often as possible you can show those different performance standards as you are producing your folio, so your folder, and also your 10 pages, which will be moderated by the SACE board. So the tips that I'm going to give you come from the Chief Assessor's report from last year. The Chief Assessor's report has been written. I've created one of these flip videos in order to explain the different aspects of it. What I'm going to do is tell you what pages I would include in a folio and how you could show the different performance standards within those 10 pages. The tips that I'm going to give you, the suggestions that I'm going to give you, are specifically what has been pointed out in the Chief Assessor's report from kids last year who were successful. This is what they did in order to show these performance standards. So you don't have to include all of them, you don't have to include any of them. However, it is suggested that you do, as these are the ones that the moderators will be looking for. Alright, so the first of your 10 pages that I would suggest that you put into the moderation pack is the proposal. So the proposal can actually show a range of different performance standards. First of all, it can show the consideration and refinement of a question. So what I would suggest in the very start of your proposal is state what your question is and how you came up with that question. So that question, what I mean by how you came up with that isn't that you spoke to your teacher, but more that you came up with this general idea. Then you refined it down by maybe using a graphics organizer and put a screenshot of the graphics organizer that you use next to your discussion of your refinement of the question. Then discuss each decision that you made in relation to that question. So if your question is about the why has the rate of type 1 juvenile diabetes increased in Australia between 2000 and 2017, the things that you need to explain are why you've chosen juvenile diabetes, why you've chosen type 1 diabetes, why you've chosen Australia, why have you chosen 2000 to 2017. These are the parts of the question that define the question. Therefore, explain why you chose type 1 over type 2 diabetes. So what I want you to do is be as specific as you possibly can in that section. The next part of it is planning the processes which are appropriate to your question. Now, every single kid in South Australia is going to find websites. That is where they're going to start because most of them decide that's the easiest place to look. What you should be showing in your proposal is not just that you're going to be using websites, but specifically to your question, where are you going to be finding information? What processes are the most specific for your question in order for you to be able to answer it? That may be interviewing someone. That may be surveying a group, particularly if you're asking for public opinion. That may be looking at newspaper articles of something. That may be searching through Trove if you're looking at something from Australia that's a historical idea. Why are you choosing the processes that you're doing and why are they specifically appropriate for your question? Okay? The next one that I'm going to suggest that you do is talk about the capability that you have chosen. There is a worksheet available through the SACE board website, and I can download it and give it to you. I would suggest that you work through that capabilities worksheet in order to decide which capability best suits your question. I would also take a screenshot of your working through that and put it next to the description of your capability in your proposal. So that that section of your proposal, what you would need to talk about is what the capability is that you've chosen, why you've chosen it, how you think it could be developed related specifically to your question, and also how you're planning on showing development of it throughout your folio. There's also ethical considerations that need to come into effect in your proposal. You always need to consider how you're going to keep yourself and others safe. That may be how you are going to, if you're going to go and speak to someone that you've never met before, making sure that someone always knows where you are. It's about if you're going to conduct an experiment, how are you going to make sure that you're ethically sound? Who are you going to ask for help in order to be able to do that? If you are interviewing someone or surveying someone, how are you going to gain permission in order to do that? And most importantly, which most kids actually forget, do you already have a bias? Do you already believe an answer to the question that you're actually asking? Are you already persuaded in a certain way, and therefore is that going to affect the way that you're going to research your question? Okay. Just that's a personal bias, and that's one of the things that was brought up in the Chief Examiner's report from last year, is that kids who did particularly well identified that they had a personal bias when they were researching. You can always go back and annotate your research proposal. Just because you've written it at the start of the year doesn't mean that, or the start of the semester doesn't mean that you can't go back and highlight your question and say, this is now changed to this because of these reasons. Okay, it doesn't mean that you can't go back and put sticky notes on it or identify where planning 1 is shown, where planning 2 is shown, where development 4 is shown. Go back. Your proposal shouldn't be clean when it's handed up. Your proposal should have information on it that shows how you've developed different performance standards throughout your entire project. All right. The second page that I would suggest that you put into your research project folio, so in your 10 pages, are journals. In class, I've discussed journals with you. Journals shouldn't be just what you did. They shouldn't just be a story. They should be reflective. So journals should go back over and discuss the challenges that you faced or the opportunities that you were given and how you use these and the decisions you made relating to those. Remember, in the evaluation, you're actually asked about the challenges and opportunities and the decisions made related to those. So if you decide that you're going to interview someone, why did you make that decision? If you decide that you're going to not interview someone, why have you decided that? If you decide that you're going to survey a group of people, how do you determine your audience that you're going to give the survey to? How have you developed the questions that you're asking? What kind of challenges are associated with that? Write about that in a journal. That's completely fine to talk about. If you're writing a journal, be reflective. Not all of your decisions need to be good decisions. Say that they weren't good and why they weren't good. Explain where you're going, how this decision has impacted now on what you're going to do for the next 2 weeks. Talk about what is needed next in the research. How has your inability to find journal articles from the last 2 years now impacted on the way that you're going to research in the future? The performance standards that can be marked through the journals are generally P2, which is the planning of research processes that are appropriate to the question. So if you decide that websites are not helpful at all, but instead you'd rather look at medical journals, talk about that in one of your journals. Another one that can be reflected on really easily is the development of knowledge and skills specific to the question. Talk about what you have learned and how now that has impacted on how you're going to research the question over the next couple of weeks. All right. The last part that I think you really should include in your journals is discussions about the capability and how your capability has developed over time. So if you are struggling to be able to show a way that your capability is developing over time, write about it in your journals. Talk about what the literacy capability is. Talk about how you've developed your literacy capability. Talk about how your question has related specifically to the literacy capability. or the personal and social capability. What is it? What do you understand about it at the very start? Then how that's developed over time and how your question relates specifically back to that development of that capability. The next thing that I would suggest that you do is put in a series of sources. It could be the first one, the 8th one, and the 25th one. Whatever it is, it doesn't actually matter. But what this, including the sources in your folio, should show is the development of the research. You need to think about credibility and reliability of the source, if it presents any type of bias. You need to talk about if it's a valid source of information and if it's also a useful source of information. I highly recommend that you go through and you number each one of your sources from 1 through until it ends. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 97, 20, 121. Right? Number them all. You can always refer back to the source number later. So I would include at least 3 sources that are annotated. Remember, if annotation is not just talking about validity and reliability, it's also going through the source, highlighting the information that's in there, writing that information in your own words. So it could be dot points along the side, or it could be something about this answer's key finding 2 because. Right? So make sure that research project is messy. It's not supposed to be beautiful. All right? So the more information that you can show, the more decision making that you can show on those 10 pages, the better. Okay? So if you've decided that a source is highly credible, highly reliable, but not useful, include that as one of your 10 pages, because that's a huge decision that you've made. The next thing that I would suggest that you include is an annotated bibliography. Now, the SACE board last year suggested that anyone who included an annotated bibliography should not include in that any of the sources that they have included as part of their other 10 pages. So, if you have numbered all of your sources from 1 through into 121, I would suggest that you show in your annotated bibliography the number 1, and then the next time you use a different type of source, that number, and then the next time you use a different type of source, that number, and then end with the most specific one, because that actually shows the development and over time of your research. It shows the development of planning research processes that are appropriate to your question, and it also allows you to be able to show the credibility, reliable, usefulness, validity, ideas that you've been thinking about those sources in a really succinct way. So 1-page annotated bibliography. I've got a little example on the side to show you what I would suggest that you put in there. It's a really good idea to show how they link to other sources in order to be able to show that, yes, I understand this idea and this idea are connected together through these 3 sources. All right. So if you include an annotated bibliography, remember not to include any of the sources that you've otherwise included as your 10 pages. It should show a range of sources that you've referred to or that you've looked at. Annotated plans. So This is kind of difficult unless you come up with some key findings that you think you need to research. So key findings are the key sub-questions that you believe that you need to be able to answer in order to be able to answer your really large research project question. I would suggest including one page of a plan and have on there the key findings that you're planning on researching. I would then have on there the sources and the page numbers that refer to that key finding, and next to the source and page number specifically what it says about that key finding, because then that demonstrates an understanding of the knowledge that you have gained over time. It also demonstrates a understanding of the question that you're asking, and that your big question actually has to be broken down into smaller parts in order to be able to be answered. When you then go to write your outcome, you have a basic plan of where to go and what you need to discuss as each part of a key finding, which means that it's easier for you to be able to put all of your information together. I would also suggest that if you change your key finding, that's reflected on that sheet of paper. And I'd also suggest that if you add to your key findings, you put those in there. If you add to your key findings the things that you're trying to find information out about, or you take away from it, go back, write a journal explaining why you've added a new key finding, or why you've gotten rid of one, or why you've compressed two into one. What is the reasoning behind that? What has your research actually told you that has made you make that decision? Okay, so that's 7 pages that I'd suggest that you put in there. So you've got 3 left over. What do you include in those? Well, what you could do is go back and have a look at the performance standards. If you've only once showed the planning of a question, can you show that in another way? Can you show your diagram in it, or can you show your thought process when you are narrowing down your topic? Can you show an explosion chart that talks about specifically the subheadings of your question that you're asking? So what your key findings are, and then from those, what kind of information are you going to have to find out about those key findings? That would be a way of showing the different questions that you're asking and the refinement of a question, and more specifically, the refinement and clarification of a question. All right. If you can't show planning of processes very easily, why don't you have a discussion with your teacher? Make a plan of what to do. You can say, okay, no one's gotten back to me in my emails. What do I do next? Your teacher will ask, well, what do you think you should do next? Where do you reckon you can gather more information from? Was one of your processes particularly useful? Could you have a look at some of your sources and see if there's anything in the bibliographies of those which will be able to help you clarify your understanding better? You could also include, if you're having difficulties showing the development of the research, you could include a different type of source as one of your 10 pages. So you could add 4 or 5 pages from a source if that's what you choose that you want to do. If you're looking at D2 and you haven't shown that very often, so the analysis of information and exploration of ideas to develop the research, why don't you do something like a glossary? Actually explain the different key terms that you've come across and how they have helped you. You could actually show development of knowledge and skills specific to the question through a glossary as well. Something that shows your development of terminology. If your literacy capability is the one that you've chosen there, a glossary actually shows a development of literacy. Not necessarily communication, but it shows a development of your understanding and incorporation of terminology. If you've decided to build something, or if you've decided to experiment, include that data. Include photos of you trying to apply spray paint to a car. There's no reason why you can't include things like experimental like research, that's still research. If it doesn't work, go back and say, well, that didn't work because of these reasons. That's still annotating. Remember, 2 minutes is the equivalent of 1 page. So if you talk for 2 minutes, you now have to hand up 9 pages plus that 2 minutes of talking. So my suggestion from here is 1, include a proposal, because that shows planning 1, planning 2, and at least capabilities. You can always go back and annotate that as much as you want. 2, write journals. Don't write them every week if you don't need to, but write journals and make sure they're reflective. If you're not discussing why you've made decisions and how you've made decisions, or what challenges and what opportunities or what capabilities you've developed, then they're not helpful. Don't tell a story, explain what you've done, all right? Number 3, the next thing that I would suggest is that you put in a series of different types of sources: emails, websites, and song lyrics. If they're the 3 things that you're researching with, put those in. The next one would be an annotated bibliography. Remember, this is what an annotated bibliography should look like. All right, and also an annotated plan, which actually talks about the key findings that you're looking for, searching for, and developing over time. Your 10 pages should be your absolute best 10 pages out of your folder. If you need to combine pages or combine ideas, so in order to show more of the more of the performance standards, go for it. You're allowed to craft your 10 pages to reflect what you've done. You are not, however, allowed to reduce in size anything that you've produced or used. If you have written on it by hand, it cannot be reduced in size. If it is an A3 size page, you can't shrink it to make it an A4 size page. I have so many examples of 10 pages for your folio and also folios. Please come and have a look at them. There are A and B examples. These are what you should be aiming for and what everyone should be able to achieve. Remember that you can put sticky notes on everything. You can write on it whatever you want, just so long as it shows the SACE board and it shows your teacher the decisions that you've made and why you've made them. Okay? So I think I've almost said enough now. I've been talking for a really long time. I'm getting a little fired up about this, but it's because it's one of those things that takes you so long to make or so long to create. I want to make sure that you're demonstrating everything that you've done rather than just going, too hard, because that doesn't reflect what you end up, the time and the effort that you've put in there. All right? Cool. I think that's about all from me. Please ask me if you have any questions. All right. Cheers.